view pricing from that customer experience perspective, not from the management perspective of trying to protect margin and all of those things.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the digital relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Craig Zawada. Here are 3 things you want to know about Craig before we start. He was at McKinsey for 13 years, and he ended up leading their North American pricing practice. He was co-author, I guess he is co-author, of The Price Advantage, one of the seminal books in pricing, fabulous book if you don't have it. And he is currently Chief Visionary Officer at Pros. Welcome, Craig.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
This is going to be so much fun. I love talking to you. A quick question. How did you get into pricing in the first place?
Oh, how did I get into pricing? Well, that was 27 years ago, and I was doing an internship for Ernst & Young in Toronto, and I didn't really mind consulting that much. I thought it was a bit long-term strategy, kind of pie-in-the-sky stuff, until I did a pricing engagement for a door skin manufacturer in Quebec. And when we did the work, it was like recommendations to raise price on some products, lower price or hold price on other products. And I remember doing what every consultant is worried about when you call a client 6 months afterwards and say, did it have any impact? And they said, well, their profits were up by 30% and they were having great success. And I thought, wow, this is an exciting area. I never learned pricing in school, and seems to be directly oriented to the bottom line, is very strategic. And I decided at that time that this is an area that was ripe for innovation and for thinking, and decided to go into pricing and never looked back since.
Yeah, I got to say that's a pretty common story where someone gets involved in a pricing project. They have such a huge impact and nobody really understands pricing. So it's like, wow, why wouldn't we go do this?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then then I was in consulting for a number of years, and then 10 years ago, I saw the world changing of the opportunities. A lot of the best practices became known on methodologies and approaches to use. And I know when I was working with clients, there was always a technology aspect. And I saw innovations that were happening, Pros in particular, that was making some really practical innovations to apply technology to pricing. And I thought, now this is the next future of applying technology to pricing. And that's why I moved from consulting to technology 10 years. There's still tons of opportunity in consulting, problems that do require, you can't really put a technology against it, but there is this huge opportunity for a whole lot of pricing problems to use technology to help execute and embed strategy within that. So that's my story of how I got to Pros.
Yeah, I think that's a very true, smart statement. And I want to push on that a little bit later in the conversation we're about to have. But I recently saw your webinar titled Winning in Turbulent Times. Now, I don't know about you. I personally am kind of tired of talking about COVID, but you had a couple pretty major points in there. And one of them was about digital transformation. And I just want to talk about the concept of digital transformation. It doesn't have to be related to COVID. It could be. First off, when you think of those words, how do you define it? What does that mean to you?
So digital transformation, in my mind, I think it's a seismic shift in pricing. And what I mean by that is, in my 27 years of pricing, most of my time in pricing has approached pricing as a management problem. So we have a whole bunch of people out there making pricing decisions, without tools, and prices are all over the map. And so therefore I need to apply people, processes, and technology to solve that management problem. I think the seismic shift that you're seeing right now, and it's related to your question, Mark, on digital transformation, is pricing now is primarily a customer problem. And what I mean by that is that the demands for frictionless buying are increasing dramatically. So the management approach to pricing historically took a lot of time and was inward focused as opposed to outward focused on the customer. And so digital transformation from my lens, and admittedly, I'm kind of like a hammer looking for nails focused on pricing, is that pricing is integral to that customer experience. And so digital transformation to me is, how do you transform your process in pricing such that you can deliver on this new customer need of getting a fair market price immediately without having to go through this management problem of pricing that companies have tried to control. And so that's why I think digital transformation and pricing is so integral and have to work together to meet that new customer need. Because those companies that still focus on a management problem are going to be outmaneuvered by those companies that view it from a customer problem.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It makes all the sense in the world. Now, I have to say, I was hoping that you were going to give me the big generic definition of digital transformation, because I see it used over and over in so many different industries. But I think you and I can just stick to talking about pricing, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's good.
So if we think about this concept of digital transformation, let's start with a B2C versus B2B conversation. It seems really obvious to me that B2C companies have made this type of transition a long time ago, because there's so much data, there's so many transactions, and we know how to do that. So what is it about B2B that's helping us get the data or help us get to that transition at this point in time?
Yeah, and Mark, I think you've touched on a few things. The data is definitely one element of it. But I think coming back to, again, your question of digital transformation, it's really being driven by the customer, right? That's what's pushing the need to it. And I know you didn't want to speak about the pandemic and all this, but
okay.
That was a trend. That was a trend that was happening, and now it's just been accelerated dramatically based upon a need, as opposed to a slow transition. It's really been accelerated, but it's a need for speed. So you have new buyers that are coming in that are used to buying in a certain way, younger generation buyers. You have I think the experiences in B2C that are transitioning over to B2B. And I think that's a trend that you're seeing. You expect the same experience in your B2C as you do in B2B. So I think those lines are being blurred. And I think in a few years, we're not going to talk about B2C or B2B. It's just going to be one approach to buying and selling goods, and the demands. And I think what's interesting is the basis of competition is absolutely changing. And there was some research done by Conference Executive Board that said that the sales experience now accounts for 50% or more of the attributes that people base their decision to buy from one supplier or another. And I think that's dramatic. Historically, we've dealt with, okay, our product has to be good, we have to be able to service it, and our price has to be right. But now it's the actual experience in buying that product that is a major attribute. So that's where I think is really pushing it. And the data, the availability of data is absolutely an important part of it, but the customer is driving it. And I think also the technology of doing it. So a lot of the early innovators in pricing technology, for example, they try to apply a B2C pricing model to B2B. So I change price and I see what happens with volume. I get a price elasticity. And the fact is, even in B2C, that's very difficult to do. So I did at McKinsey and razor blade pricing, and we had retail data down to store level. And even then, accounting for the shelf of where it was, competitive price, you needed an enormous amount of data to get at that. But the innovation that I think you've seen recently is a practical way of getting at willingness to pay and market relevant pricing without that simplified, price elasticity calculation. So you have the customer need as well as the technology that I think has really allowed this ability to apply some of those principles that are universal to a B2B context.
What's the technology? How do I get to that willingness to pay more accurately?
Well, what it is it's not a pure price elasticity. So I change price and here's what happens to volume. It's getting at what are the indicators of willingness to pay. So for example, what the technology does is it searches for attributes that give me an indication of whether I'm close to market price. So in a digital context, it may not be whether I won that sale and get the sale. It may be if someone looked at it and whether they bought it or not. Well, that's a closer, if I get enough of those data points, I know what the response rate is to that. Or it could be what's my inventory level that's out there. If I have inventory and competitors don't, well, I get a sense that there must be a higher willingness to pay because I have availability. So things like that, you try to get attributes that get at willingness to pay, and then it's a test and learn over time. So you're continually, and that's one of the unique aspects of AI is you improve that over time. It's a learning algorithm which improves over time. So the availability of those attributes has become much greater than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, so now we have the data around all those attributes, essentially, so we can see what's going on, where we may not have been able to do that before. Okay.
Exactly.
So when I've always thought about the difference between B2B and B2C, almost always I jumped in my mind to, well, a B2B has a direct sales force. And not always, of course, but oftentimes they do. And as soon as we put a direct sales force in the way, doesn't that mess up our ability to use AI, our ability to, our need to respond instantly?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, Mark, that's changing is if you look at most of the pricing models in B2B, too much of it is high touch, right? So it's based on the salesperson interaction. So I want to answer your question first off on, can you still apply AI in those circumstances? The answer is yes, you can. So where you have a negotiation, you could still capture attributes of, okay, is this a bundled sale? What other products are involved in it? What is the history of this customer? What have they bought historically? What's the trend? All of that data is incredibly predictive on willingness to pay. So we have a solution, a technology that what it does in that situation is it presents an envelope. It's a floor, target, and stretch price. And that varies by customer depending upon all of those attributes. And so we know that improves that decision and judgment that salesperson needs and requires at that point of time. And it's kind of like when a salesperson is negotiating, they're coming alone. And what AI does is it brings the collective experience of hundreds or even thousands of salespeople together to say, well, this is what the market price is, and this is what you should target. So it's like being armed, and it gives salespeople much more confidence in those circumstances. So absolutely it's applied in that situation. But I mentioned that what's happening now is companies are realizing that they can't have 80% of the transactions as high touch, that all the things that I've talked about previously, the customers are demanding, they don't want to go through that negotiation process. And we've seen this, we've done some research with Hanover, an external firm, and B2B buyers hate that process, right? And yes, there are going to be big deals that are long drawn out negotiations, but there's a huge percentage of deals that should be moving towards more of a self-serve model, where the challenge from a pricing standpoint is you have to get all of that information beforehand, and you have to deliver that market relevant price immediately. And most pricing organizations aren't built to do that, but that's where the world is going. And so that really is, we see the big change in where AI is absolutely applicable, because now you only have the technology to make those decisions. It can't be a back and forth negotiation. And the other thing is, what's interesting in our research, over 2/3 of buyers actually trust an algorithm more than an in-person salesperson to negotiate price, because there's objectivity around that. And if you think about this, a ride-sharing service, right? If you went into a cab and there was no meter and you sort of negotiated price, you wouldn't feel very comfortable. But with ride-sharing services, yes, it's variable, but you know what those variables are based on. And you may not be happy about paying a higher price, but you know, okay, it's going to bring more drivers on board. So there's transparency and objectivity to that. And that's the interesting part, and where AI is incredibly applicable and really important in this environment, in the future environment, is being able to make those decisions without human intervention to set that market relevant price.
That's very interesting. Obviously, we know that you can't trust a salesperson. And so doesn't that just make sense? I'm going to trust my algorithm more than I'm going to trust a salesperson. Salespeople, you know, I'm joking, right?
Well, I think it drives them to higher value activities, right? And I think this personal back and forth, it's always, you know, am I a bad negotiator? Am I paying higher price than other people? I mean, it makes a lot of sense of, you know, inherent in the process, there's lack of trust. So,
yeah. So really interesting. You guys, you're older like me. Do you remember when Saturn came out and said, we're not going to negotiate for prices? And that worked for a few years. And then all of a sudden they started negotiating prices again. Mm-hmm. What's the analogy there? Because it seems like they, in the B2C world, they were trying to say, let's get away from negotiating, but we can't get away from negotiating cars. Why is that? And why do we think it's going to work in the B2B world?
Well, again, I think it's not a question of, you know, 0 or 1, whether it'll happen or not. I think it's the situations where it applies, number one. And number two, it's the confidence level that you have in the prices that you're setting. So a lot of this back and forth negotiation is due to a lack of confidence of knowing what the market price is. So if you have a high degree of confidence, if you know you have it and no one else does, and you know what the competitive prices are, then you could say the price is the price. I have confidence in that pricing. So I think it requires, you know, first of all, what is the occasion where you're selling the product, and what is the confidence level that you can get to set that market relevant price? And I think what's happening is the occasions are growing of where people, they want self-serve, they don't want this long drawn out process. I mean, Gartner just did a recent research, 70+% of B2B buyers were frustrated with their last purchase because it took too long, it was wasn't responsive enough. And so the question is, if you have the ability to deal with that, you're going to be at an advantage. And I'll give you an example of this. We have a customer in the Saint-Gobain glass. So they sell glass into construction designers, contractors. And if you think about it, if you're speccing out a shower and you're a contractor, you have to measure it and you have to get the width, and there's certain options. And then you call someone, you send in the sheet, and it takes a few days, and then, oh, we don't have availability on the 10 millimeter. You have to go to 8 millimeter, and the price. Well, they put everything in an app that you're on the job site. You can spec it in. You could see the price, availability. And prior to COVID, they had 10 to 15% of their volume. Now, in 45 days, that moved to 80% of their volume through that process. And it's because they've had to, but they believe they're capturing a disproportionate share of the market because they have a frictionless way of buying. So that's really what's driving it. It's more of those occasions for this, you know, frictionless buying. Now, Saint-Gobain Glass is negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal. Yes, you know, that's probably not applicable, but for those occasions, there was no reason why it had to go through this long drawn out process.
Makes all the sense in the world. And I think I love the answer that it's not a 0 or a 1. And as soon as you said that, it suddenly hit me in the car industry. Nowadays, I can go buy a car online, right? And the price is just given to me and there's no negotiating. And so it's my choice as a buyer how I want to do that.
Right. Yeah. And I think the other thing is people want choices, right? So they want to be able to configure their choices and understand what are the implications of that. So, you know, you can have ways of reducing price, right? If you take options away or you do other things. So that's where there's a trade-off of price for benefits that you're getting there.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Now my company, I don't do very many transactions a year. So I'm guessing it doesn't make sense to have Pros AI quoting my deals for me, but how many deals does it take? How many transactions does it take? How big of a company? How do you say this is where it starts to make sense to use some kind of AI to figure this out?
Yeah, and Mark, what I would say, whenever you have complexity on customers, products, and salespeople, right, that's a great fit. So if you have all three of those, it's an incredible fit. So for example, in distribution companies, you have tens of thousands of products, tens of thousands of customers, and usually hundreds of salespeople. Perfect fit for AI, because you can take all that information and find in that complexity opportunity. If you have I was talking to a company today, they had 6 customers that they sell to, and very complex. Well, probably is not applicable there. So usually you need a few hundred to a few thousand transactions in order for the technology to be helpful. And you need a complexity on those 3 dimensions, preferably 2 of those dimensions for that to really be applicable.
Yeah, and so the more complex it becomes, the more valuable having somebody reduce that complexity for us becomes.
Yeah,
nice.
Absolutely.
Nice. Craig, we are running out of time, but I have to ask the final question. What's one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Yeah, the one piece of advice related to this topic that I would say, Mark, is what I've found in talking to a lot of companies and pricing organizations is a disconnect between the digital transformation and the pricing groups. And it's interesting. You'll talk, there'll be a project going on. I want to improve pricing discipline. I want to apply technology. And then, what's going on in digital transformation? Oh, they're trying to, transform the customer experience. Well, are these two connected? And almost always they're not. And so the one piece of advice that I had relevant to this topic is absolutely those need to be integrated together, because I think if you're going through a digital transformation and you're creating this awesome frictionless experience, and then you're putting your list price, which is not market-based, is static, you might have 2 customers that buy on it, you're not going to get the benefit out of those digital transformation initiatives. So from a pricing perspective, you have a tremendous opportunity to have impact by integrating price into that digital transformation, because it's one of the most fundamental things that is part of that customer experience and buying. And so my one piece of advice is, from my observation and talking and working with a lot of companies, is make those initiatives much more integrated together in order to have that impact. And to your question earlier, is view pricing from that customer experience perspective, not from the management perspective of trying to protect margin and all of those things. So I think it's a huge opportunity. Now is a time more than ever where pricing organizations can have a huge impact on their companies. And that would be my advice, I think, immediately for companies to help make that transition.
Nice. And I want to try to restate what you said to see if I understand it or this has the right value. But I think what you just said to us was, when I'm doing a digital transformation in, say, marketing or the buyer's experience, I'm gathering tons and tons of data in that area. This is information that could help us understand customers' willingness to pay. Why aren't we integrating that into our pricing systems?
Well, that, Mark, and being able to deliver those market relevant prices to the digital channels. So I see that not being done enough right now. Again, they're handing it off to pricing. We'll send over list prices, and then the digital channels don't grow in volume because the prices are unrealistic. So I think what the pricing groups need to get comfortable with is taking that 80% high touch negotiation, review, deal desk, and pushing that out there to their digital transformation with market relevant prices. To get out there without this deal desk and negotiation protection mechanism that most pricing organizations take. And that's where pricing groups need to be comfortable of, how do you do that? How do you deliver on that customer experience? So I think it's not only getting the data, it's delivering those market-based prices comfortably through the digital channels.
Nice. So it almost sounds like digital transformation and pricing means negotiate less.
Yes, I think that's a great part of it. It's getting, instead of 80, 20%. Only 20% is a through the deal desk negotiation back and forth. That's the challenge. But the companies that will do it, they're going to win a disproportionate share.
Nice. Craig, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
You can contact us at pros.com is the website, and my email is czawada@pros.com. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Episode 79, all done. Would you please leave us a review? You know that they're very, very valuable to us. They help other people find the show. So please do that. And also don't forget to join our community at championsofvalue.com. Everything I publish that's free shows up there. It's an easy place for you to find the things that I publish. If you just follow me on LinkedIn, you probably don't see everything. So please join us there. If you have any questions or comments about the podcast or about pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.